Live from PNT, it's Weekday Night Live. On Thursday, May 14th, PNT Network was pleased to welcome Jonathan Ezra Goldman to celebrate and discuss his new book, Hidden Histories of Jazz Age New York, a panoramic view of New York City in the 1920s, uncovering hidden histories from within entertainment, politics, arts, technology, and the law. Jonathan was joined in conversation by Esther Crain, author of The Gilded Age in New York, 1970 to 1910.
Please help me in welcoming Jonathan and Esther.
Can I jump in and thank you for moderating this event, Esther?
Absolutely. This is going to be a lot of fun. I feel a really good vibe in this room. Jonathan and I met for coffee just to kind of discuss the event, and I will do that if I'm moderating an event or doing a Q&A with an author, and it was just so smooth. I was like, I'm not worried about this one at all. So I think when I asked you about questions, if you wanted to go over them, you said, ask anything. I'll answer anything. So my kind of author, right?
So I mean, I'll try. What I meant was because by the end, I'm gonna my brain will run down in an hour or so, maybe. So I wanted to make sure that I don't forget to say thank you for moderating this. Esther Crain's blog, Ephemeral New York, is amazing. It must have. How many pages are you up to? I mean, you must be are you in the thousands? You must be.
Well, it's been we're closing in on like 20 years. So
right. Yeah.
it
was absolutely when I discovered it inspired me because there's so much of a sort of thematic kinship in the work you're doing there and the work that I'm trying to do in this book. So I'm really grateful to you for all that.
Yeah,
work.
of course. So that's a good segue into my first question. Whenever I talk to authors, I'm always really curious what the genesis of the book was. And I'd really like to find out from you, was there just an idea about telling, sort of the underside of the 1920s New York? Was there a specific story that got you into it and then you came up with the narrative? Tell me the process. How did it come about?
Okay. As many of you know, I'm an academic and a literary critic by training. So I have been working on this period, studying literature and culture. And because I have a historicist bent, I was doing some amount of archival research that was always supposed to support my readings of the literature and the films I was studying. And I gradually got more interested in the archival research itself. So I it wound up inverting the content of my work, where I was focusing more on what I was finding in the archives and less on using that to interpret the literary works. At the same time, I was really inspired by a lot of the reading I was doing across a wide range of different kinds of works into just the experience of walking the streets of New York City and treating it as an archaeological site and looking at the present, but seeing the past behind it or underneath it or sort of alongside of it in various ways. And I'm a James Joyce scholar, so Ulysses is actually a book that is very much about seeing history written onto the present. Some of the other, The Power Broker is a very obvious influence on this book. And I'll throw out something more eccentric, which is to say Alan Moore's graphic novel From Hell, which is about traversing the streets of London and seeing the past underneath the present, was also very influential. So putting all of this stuff together, and also my desire to write about New York City, where I'm from, and my desire to write a book that would go beyond academic audiences, that birthed this work, which took the form of not just the book, but at first it was going to be a book, then it became a website, then the book emerged alongside the website, and so now they both exist.
It's kind of funny, the Ulysses connection. That's one of my favorite books as well. And as I'm reading your book, I'm thinking like, this is almost like a journey. Like, I'm not Leopold Bloom, not quite, but it does feel like an odyssey of some kind. Like you're just kind of like dipping into these, forgotten, hidden histories, as you call it. It's really, I can see kind of a resemblance there, a little bit, but. So tell me about the research. Is this the kind of a book that just like, as you started diving into it, it kind of like unfolded, and as a lot of authors say, like the book told itself, like the stories just came to you, or was it agonizing and torturous and 10 years of late nights and
How do you know about the late nights? um, yeah, there were. I mean, the research itself was the least agonizing part of it. The research itself was always a pleasure. Even those times when I'd start pulling on a thread and I couldn't find where it went. And sometimes there were because there are limitations to what is archived, right? I mean, the digitization of the archive made this book possible, but I also had many pleasurable moments in archives around the city with that tactile experience of seeing something, holding something in my hand, knowing that, thinking I'm pretty sure nobody knows about this, or seeing stuff on microfilm that I couldn't believe what has not been digitized. That, stuff that I would find on microfilm that is so valuable and so interesting that I would then subsequently write about. So the research part was always exciting. Hammering it into a narrative, that was what was the word you used? Excruciating, agonizing, excruciating part. And I went through so many different versions of the shape of this book. And one thing that I kept finding as I was forging and reforging the structure is I was trying to be very attuned to the idea of not marginalizing the marginalized stories. So that was really important to me, to make sure that anyone who picked up the book would immediately recognize that this is a book that is about uncovering stories that were hidden for a reason, that were suppressed for a reason. I mean, mostly, I'm not conspiratorial about it. Most of the reason was because they don't fit in with the narratives we like to hear. We, society writ large, like to hear about the 1920s. They undermine our sense of what New York City in the 1920s was. So I kept wanting, I kept trying to make sure that with the structure I was creating, those stories were foremost, or at least at the top level of the surface. I mean, so for example, I find the story of the Babe Ruth trade, the sale of Babe Ruth from Boston to New York, really central to the identity of New York in the 1920s. And there was a moment where I was going to start off with the book with that, and then I thought to myself, I can't start this book with the most famous person in New York in the 1920s and still have people look at it as a story of hidden histories. So I kept having to push it back, and then that chapter kept wanting to worm its way to the front, and we had this ongoing battle for a while.
It came out well.
Thank you.
So, New York in the 1920s. Is there a way for you to kind of sum up your view of it, the vibe of it? Now, we all have this idea that everybody was like wearing raccoon coats and going to speakeasies, and Zelda Fitzgerald is jumping in the fountain, and economic good times, and everybody's having a blast. That's obviously, reading your book and just being aware, that's not the case. Is there any way for you to maybe give us kind of set the tone of the 1920s in New York that you're writing about?
Yes. So two things. One is so I don't have the numbers handy, but the economic disparities were atrocious as they are now, right? I mean, the numbers of the whatever percent of the wealth in the United States belonging in the hands of whatever percent of the people. They are numbers that we are very familiar with hearing. I mean, a different kind of historian or an economist would be able to talk about that more fluently than I could. I would say that, I mean, when we hear these stories about New York City, and when you close your eyes and you picture Gatsby's parties, you're probably picturing a bunch of white people, right? But there was a huge percentage of New Yorkers who were foreign-born, and there were as many cultures of New York City as there are now, as there always have been. But when we think of the 1920s New York City, we tend to think of the dominant culture. So that's all one thing. I could read a section to sort of set the scene a little bit.
Definitely.
Okay. So I have a section early in my book. Okay, one of the challenges here is going to be holding the microphone and also holding the book, but fortunately it's here. Okay, so my second chapter of the book is called Streets, and it starts off with January 1st, 1920, and a story about a dog. But within a couple pages, I move on to, and it talks, at the beginning, it talks about New Yorkers emerging from their homes on January 1st, 1920. And then I have a section called Traffic. And I'll read from this. So this is about emerging into the streets of New York City early in the 1920s. Manhattan and Brooklyn were flush with peddlers pushing carts or standing alongside of them, or hoofing it through the city, selling candy, nuts, fruit, balloons, pens, and sometimes condoms. They even hawked their wares at the gates to Holy Cross Cemetery in Brooklyn. Some vendors possessed the compulsory street license, others did not. You could find many along Harlem's 7th Avenue. Nearby, at 135th Street and Lenox, Lillian Harris Dean, popularly known as Pigfoot Mary, sold her popular snacks to customers appreciative of the culinary evocation of their southern roots. One longtime New York City street food tradition was on the wane, with over 600 million gallons of raw sewage being dumped into local waters every day. The oyster industry was in a tailspin and would be officially shut down by 1927. But a new street snack was on the rise. Dog wagons offering frankfurters were scattered throughout the city, though the modern hot dog cart that enabled cooking frankfurters anywhere wouldn't arrive until later in the decade. Pretzels were already big, though, and grade school time, there's a picture of a pretzel vendor with his big pretzels. Peddlers jostled for space with pedestrians, horse-drawn carriages, automobiles, and the occasional bicycle, alongside the streetcars, trolleys, and white uniformed street sweepers and water wagons cleaning up after everyone else. Some avenues were shadowed by the elevated train tracks. That's, I put in the elevated train tracks because somebody might not be from New York and need to know what the L means. Believe me, I wanted to just write shadowed by the, some avenues were shadowed by the L. Some avenues are shadowed by the L overhead, snaking through the city, bombarding ears with rattling steel and squealing brakes. All the streets were two-way, if not downright polydirectional. So I have a little bit later in this chapter, but I should mention it here. I talk about how there were no traffic signals. So the first traffic signal was put in at 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue in 1920, and they gradually put them up and down Fifth Avenue. But the rest of the city, everyone just sort of made do. Maybe that's why we all walk the way we walk across streets in New York City today. A major cause of chaos, cars were proliferating, spurred by the auto industry's new offers of cheaper models and layaway plans. There were over 200,000 licensed automobiles in New York City in 1920, triple the number from 5 years earlier. So I should say that in reverse. There were about 60,000 in 1915, but in 1920 there were 200,000. By 1924, congestion had gotten so bad that one police commissioner proposed draining the East River and using it as a roadway.
There's a great illustration of that. If you are a newspaper archive fan like I am, check it out.
Yeah, I love that one. One thing you would rarely see, cars parked on the street. The parking limit was 1 hour during the day and 3 at night for all streets. Taxis, not yet standardized as yellow, swarmed the city in all the blues, reds, whites, and blacks that car manufacturers made available. So I didn't know this because, you know, we've seen all these black and white photographs and films. I thought all the taxis were black. I thought all the cars were black. I didn't know that you could buy cars in different colors. And I never understood this moment for those of you, I'm sure so one of the literary texts that sort of hovers around this book is The Great Gatsby, for obvious reasons, set in New York in 1922, and well-read classic book. And there's this moment that I never understood when Myrtle Wilson lets all these taxis go past until she hails a maroon one, and I never understood that she was picking by the color. I mean, the taxi, the color maroon is mentioned, but it never occurred to me that there were that there were many colors of taxis. So that's. Let me set this. Let me go on just to set the scene a little more while I'm talking about these taxis. Fay Taxi deployed gray cars featuring distinctive lights, three-toned horns, and swastikas, the symbols that had in 1920 been appropriated as an emblem of the Nazi Party. Owner Larry Fay had started his company in 1922, funding it with booze. He had become an accidental alcohol smuggler in 1920 when a fare hailed him on the street and asked to be driven to Canada. Fay got to Canada. He saw that the guy was buying booze there, and Fay was like, well, I might as well load my taxi up with Canada. With Canada, that's hilarious. I might as well load my taxi up with alcohol, which he did, drove it back to the city, sold it, and then he was like, oh, I can do this all the time. So he started doing that until he owned his own taxi company. Taxi drivers called hackies. So the profession of taxi driver was new. Taxi drivers were called hackies, and they often fought violently among themselves for choice locations, such as outside Grand Central Terminal. Fay took the step of hiring Oni Madden, whom he knew from the alcohol underground, to provide muscle for his drivers. So he hired Oni Madden. Oni Madden got his tough guys to protect Fay's taxi drivers, and the two of them did so well that they wound up buying a club called Club Deluxe from Jack Johnson, the boxer, and they renamed it. Anyone know what they renamed it? Bob. They renamed it the Cotton Club, and that was the birth of the Cotton Club, with the most iconically segregated jazz club in Harlem at the time. Okay, that's my scene setting. Sorry to go on a tangent.
When I heard about... I love the details about the food probably most, because you can really tell a city by its street food and the era and how that's changed. So you have a line that starts one of your chapters, and it says, New York in the 1920s was a city of spectacle. What does that mean exactly? I ask that because I do a lot of writing about the Gilded Age, and the Gilded Age is generally considered this era of spectacle. What's the difference?
Well, there are a few ways I can approach this. Not just spectacle, mass media spectacle, mass mediated, mass reproduced spectacle, electronic machine-made spectacle. So that's one difference. So the neon lights of Broadway, were the kind of neon lighting that they had along the Great White Way, as they called it, which had was already established. But the new kind of lighting went up in the early 20s, and the city tried to regulate it, and the Broadway Association fought them. They wanted more lights. So that's one version of spectacle. But there's also the sort of conscious deployment of spectacle for commercial reasons that we are all familiar with, that really explodes in the 1920s. So there had always been publicity, but now there was the publicist, right? That job was invented more or less in the 1920s. And again, this is one of the reasons why I think Babe Ruth is so interesting, because he was the first professional athlete to have his own publicist who would do things like ghostwrite articles for him and get him into movies and things like that. So and the really famous publicist at the time was. So I can rattle off a lot of names, but once in a while one of them eludes me.
Oh,
But
Bernays.
what? Yes,
Bernays.
Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, who considered himself the father of publicity. And I write a little bit about him in the book, but what's really important to me in this book is writing about the other figures too. There's someone else, Bell Moskowitz, who sort of at the same time had a similar claim to inventing this idea of the publicist. And Bell Moskowitz worked for Al Smith and helped him get the Port Authority bill published. She created this publicity film. This was her big innovation, Bell Moskowitz. She started using films for publicity purposes. So she would produce a little film and then send it around with a projector to audiences, to offices of people who she needed to convince. There was no Port Authority yet, and there was this move to create an organization that would organize all of the transportation in the waterways between New York City and New Jersey. And they wanted to pass this bill, and she created this movie about a potato, a little cartoon, humanistic anthropozoid potato, and its long journey from the Midwest to your grocery store shelf, right? With the point being, it was so sad that it took it so long to get to your kitchen table. And if only we had a Port Authority, it would get there so much more quickly. This film is, as far as I can tell, lost. This is what I mean by how the research could get frustrating sometimes.
This is not on YouTube. We can't all go home and watch
not
this.
unless someone's put it up there in the last couple of years, like since I spent a lot of time looking for it. The idea of spectacle as something you could consciously use for these various purposes, I think is one of the distinguishing factors. And I write in my book about how this is put to commercial uses and also political uses. So the spectacle of a parade was put to interesting political uses and in different ways. I've examples of that, like baby parades, overalls parades, Marcus Garvey's parades. Marcus Garvey was incredibly savvy about how to use spectacle to promote this combination of the collective that he was promoting of black people in Harlem and around the world that he would somehow sit on top of. So that's another distinguishing factor is the spectacle was this weird combination of the mass alongside the individual. The individuality and spectacle got wrapped up in one another at this time.
It leads me to ask another question, which is that it seems like the whole idea of being a celebrity was invented in the 1920s, right? I mean, these are the first mass market celebrities that were nationally known. Can you talk about a few of them? I mean, you mentioned Babe Ruth.
Yeah.
Marcus Garvey was a celebrity.
Yeah.
Jack Johnson.
Yeah. So now I'm thinking because I've written a lot about celebrity and literature in the past, and I really tried not to go too celebrity heavy in this book, but it's so important for understanding the way various things, the relationship between mainstream society and marginalized society in the 1920s. So I'll talk about Eva Tanguay, who is most famous now because she got Dorothy Parker fired through no fault of her own. Dorothy Parker, bear with me here, Dorothy Parker insulted actress Billie Burke by comparing her to Eva Tanguay. Eva Tanguay was this racy vaudeville star at the time, considered extremely tawdry. Billie Burke, this is Glenda the Good Witch, going ahead in time to 1939. But in the 1920s, she was trying to establish herself as a serious actress. She was in a Somerset Maugham play, that's serious. And so she, being compared to Eva Tanguay, did not sit well with her. So she complained to her husband. Her husband happened to be Florence Ziegfeld. Florence Ziegfeld happened to be one of the major advertisers in Vanity Fair, where Dorothy Parker wrote the review. So Florence Ziegfeld complained to a guy named Condé Nast, who owned Vanity Fair, who told his editor, "Get her, she's done," as theater critic. The editor, Frank Cranenshield, this is like threads upon threads. Frank Cranenshield is the grandnephew of Benjamin Bradley of the Washington Post. Anyway, but that's not relevant to the 1920s. Frank Cranenshield took Dorothy Parker out to the Plaza Hotel tea room, praised her writing, and then told her she was out as theater critic. And the legend is that Dorothy Parker promptly ordered the most expensive dessert on the menu and then got up and left. So that was the end of her as theater critic. Now, Dorothy, the person she had compared Billy Berg to, I have daughters. I almost said Billie Eilish. The person she had compared Billy Berg to, Ava Tunge, was one of these very early examples of someone whose claim to fame was being famous in a way, or who understood that the ascent to fame had everything to do with drawing attention to yourself and didn't have to have that much to do with anything else, because she was the way people in article after article she's written about as not being a great actress, not being a great singer, not being a great dancer, not having exceptional looks, but she had what she called personality. And she called it that in a song. She didn't write it, but she had a song in which she sang about all that matters is if you have personality. What that meant was something that was performable, and it was outside, not inside, right? The previous generations of U.S. Of U.S. culture, the values were character. That was something you have in here, right? Character. Personality is something you have like out here, or you have it in the newspapers, because Ava Tunge was really good at making her private life public, and she did scandalous things, and some of these scandalous things were racially tinged. So she got the word out that she had extramarital affairs. She got the word out that she had an affair with a black man. That was a big taboo at the time. She was white. She did this one very risque thing. This was in 1909. This is one of the ways she really increased her notoriety. She arranged. She was in a production of Salome, Oscar Wilde's play Salome, and she really produced the play herself. Didn't direct it, but she was in charge of every act. By this point in her career, it had only been a few years, but she had a lot of control over. She was also very good at business and very good at establishing control over anything she was in. That was one of her many talents. So she, for Salome, there's a scene where Salome dances the dance of the seven veils and just unrobes herself in front of John the Baptist, and she had a black actor playing John the Baptist. So a black man on stage watching a white woman get undressed was a big deal in 1909, and that was, again, this is like a risque thing she did in order to increase her fame. So she's an interesting figure because it was at mid-century, decades later, that some cultural critic coined the term famous for being famous, or celebrated for being a celebrity. But she was anticipating that in the teens, really, and her reputation was such that Billy Burke and Florence Ziegfeld were not happy to have that comparison made by Dorothy Parker.
So she's like ahead of her time in the Kardashian era we live in. So there's a real heavy presence in the book of queer stories. Would love it if you could just kind of walk us through what it would have been like to be a queer person in New York City in the 1920s. I have this idea that because there was a lot of bohemians in the village and a lot of sort of radical thinkers that there would be a lot of acceptance. But
Well, there was a this is the story of the 1920s, and I think almost every category there was a step forward and a step back. There was a lot of repression. So, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the 1920s in general is that there had been a lot of, I think, what probably most people in this room would call progress in terms of the social world and civil rights over the previous decades. But it was in the 1920s that some of that progress really became visible and also really caused a backlash. So if you were gay in the 1920s, you would, I'm sure, percentage-wise, most of them were closeted, and or kept it a secret from anyone except their closest, their closest acquaintances. But there was a thriving culture, and then the backlash. So there were clubs around the Greenwich Village that were known as gay hangouts. There was a famous Eve's Tea House in the village, which was started by a woman who was it got raided, it got shut down, and she got deported, and she wound up dying in Auschwitz, actually, a decade and a half later. But there were raids around the Greenwich Village in the early 1920s of clubs and bars and tea houses that were known to be frequented by the gay community, and some of them would relocate and open back up, and some of them we don't know what happened. But gay culture was hugely important to everything we know about the New York in the 1920s, even if we don't always think of it that way. It was like huge. I mean, it was a huge part of the Harlem Renaissance, and I think this is a suppressed story in a way that unless you study this stuff or you're very familiar with it, you might not think of the fact that so many of the major figures of the Harlem Renaissance that we think of today had had some kind of queer identity, and a lot of the events and centers, places where the Harlem Renaissance was thought of as flourishing were places that were in some way simultaneously a place where queer communities were flourishing. So the salons of Harlem, or as I write about in the book, Alelia Walker's salons. Alelia Walker, who was the daughter and heir of Madam C.J. Walker, who was the black billionaire. Millionaire, excuse me, not billionaire. That would be crazy. The black millionaire for hair care products. So her daughter would host these parties that were known as places where gender nonconformity was very welcome, as were the famous parties, the balls, the Harlem balls that were called fairy balls. I mean, at the time they were actually called, I won't say this word out loud just because I won't, F-word balls. That was in Harlem, common parlance at the time. So those were also sites of queer community in Harlem that were related to the Harlem Renaissance. But there were also these various fairy balls. I mean, I shouldn't say that either, but it's a little awkward. But that's what they were called, fairy balls, around New York, in other places in New York City, including at what then became later the Palladium. I think that's a funny site for it, going back in the history. And then there are other examples that come up in the book. I think one really interesting one is Rose Brenner, who was the chair of the Brooklyn chapter of the National Council of Jewish Women, and was so successful at recruitment that she became the president of the national organization, and she was the first unmarried woman to ever be in that position. And she lived with a woman. It was a well-known secret, well-kept secret. Not sure what to say, that she was in a lesbian relationship with her partner, and she was really effective at her job and very well respected. and then died in 1926, quite tragically, at a in her 30s, I think she was.
I know you mentioned the Mount Morris Baths too, which is pretty iconic Harlem queer kind of hangout or spot. I don't know what you would want to call it.
Supposedly, that's where County Cullen met his life partner, that then led to the dissolution of his marriage to Yolanda Dubois, who was Du Bois, who was W.B. Du Bois's daughter. So County Cullen and Yolanda Du Bois were married, but then he was gay, and that didn't last very long.
You do a lot of great research into 1920s Harlem, and I think it's fair to say that that's when Harlem, as the cultural capital of the world, kind of emerged. Would you agree?
Did you say as the cultural capital of the world?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
the African American cultural capital of the world.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily disagree if you had just said the cultural capital of the world, but it'd be a bold statement too. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is in institution after institution around Harlem, there was this recognition of the way the community had turned black or was turning black. So libraries, YMCA's, et cetera, they all were under white leadership, and they realized that their constituents were all largely black all of a sudden, and gradually, not gradually, but quickly over a period in the late teens and early 1920s. And so it's absolutely the time that Harlem was established as the center of U.S. black life, if not the cultural capital for the African diaspora around the world. And I read about the 135th Street Library. There was churches, libraries, I said libraries already, jazz clubs. And maybe this is a good time to do another reading, because I'm thinking, so I did a fun reading, right, the streets part. And I'm thinking maybe I should do like a not as fun, by which I mean, sort of one of the more dire histories or tragic histories. So this is the story of Solomon Riley. And this is in a chapter called, what's this chapter called? This is in a chapter called Unmapped NYC, Indigenous, Carceral, Toxic. And it's largely, or it's partly about the islands of New York City, and the islands that all hosted carceral institutions. And I get to one called Hart Island. 13 miles northeast of Midtown Manhattan, Hart Island has as good a claim as anywhere to representing New York City's physical and conceptual margins. Over the last 3 centuries, it has hosted workhouses for orphans, quarantine zones for tuberculosis sufferers, penitentiaries, drug treatment centers, and most famously, New York's largest Potter's Field, a burial ground for the indigent, anonymous, and unclaimed. It is where Solomon Riley, Millionaire Riley as he was known at the time, a real estate mogul originally from Barbados, planned to establish a black amusement park and resort at a time when the dozen-plus amusement parks around the 5 boroughs operated under Jim Crow policies. At the start of the 1920s, Hart was the site of an overcrowded 875-person prison, and of course, the Potter's Field. 6,000 bodies per year were being interred there, half of them unidentified. The city owned the entire island except for a narrow 4-acre strip on the island's southwest tip, valued at $16,000. When that went up for sale in 1922, New York City Mayor John Hyland passed on it, a mistake eventually called Hyland's Folly. He figured that no one else would be interested and the city would eventually scoop it up for free. Oops. In April 1923, Riley shelled out $35,000 for the land, announcing that he would turn the site into a bungalow colony and amusement park for black customers, specifically catering to the burgeoning Harlem community. And I quote from Riley there. Over the next 2 years, Riley would build a 200-foot boardwalk, a dance hall, 8 boarding houses, and 120 changing stalls. He turned a discarded ice boat into a bathing pavilion and mapped out a 4-hole golf course. Everything was divided from the rest of the island by a thick hedge. And, I'm going to read for several more paragraphs, but I'm just going to ask you all, do you think this place ever opened? What do you think? Who thinks it never opened? Raise your hand. Yeah, okay, you're all smart. From the start, municipal forces were alarmed at the prospect of an amusement park so close to the reformatory, and or they engaged in pearl clutching to disguise their racist objections to Riley's venture. In June and July of 1923, commissioners from the Department of Correction and the Prison Association visited the site. They complained. So did officials from organizations that would seem to have less stake in the situation, such as the Real Estate Bureau of the city's Department of Finance. And in the end, they all joined on an official recommendation that the city condemn the land and purchase Riley's plot. In the meantime, the municipal government was throwing obstacles in Riley's path. You need to supply your own power, it told him, so he built an electrical grid. You need to supply your own water treatment, it told him, so he built his own water treatment system. You need to supply your own transportation, so he arranged to rent a fleet of 60 motorboats in order to take customers from Harlem. The park was referring to the press as this is in quotations, Negro Coney Island. It was set to open on July 4th, 1925. As the date approached, Riley's opponents were panicking about the idea of the park opening. An organization called the Broadway Association inspected the site and launched a campaign to stop the development. Various organizations made the same demands, and with 2 weeks to go, the city board of aldermen, and a note, who was president of the board of aldermen at the time, a guy named Fiorello LaGuardia. They put a halt to the project. They were suddenly concerned that prison inmates, many of whom were black, would commandeer boats and escape the island. The irony was noted by now legendary black journalist J.A. Jackson in an editorial. He wrote, "It is pitiful that we should not be wanted anywhere, even next door to the prison and the cemetery. Yet there are plenty of Negroes in both places." The city, desperate to prevent the park from opening, condemned the land and was eventually forced to buy it out for $144,000. That was a nice haul for Riley, though the site was now valued by some at 5 times that amount. The city's amusement parks remained segregated until the 1960s. Eventually, everything Riley built was torn down and removed, except for the water treatment system, which New York City would make use of for the next 50 years. And I have more about Riley here, how he kept trying to create spaces of black entertainment, and the city kept opposing him. And the last thing I have about him here is that we only know about him from a couple of obituaries and one very, very short Works Progress Association report. There are no known photographs of him. It's really as if history tried to erase him. And then as a real side note, I just want to say this. It's not in this part of the book, but I mentioned it elsewhere. So the judge who made the city pay up for Riley's parcel, he was a judge who had presided over trials of, not trials, arraignments of these teens and kids in their early 20s during the Straw Hat riots of 1922. And so now we're going from the tragic and horrific to the absurd, back to the absurd, right? So the Straw Hat riots were these things that happened every year, but there was one year that it got particularly bad, were roving gangs of youth. So you weren't supposed to wear a straw hat after what was called, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, Brown Hat Day. Like Straw Hat Day was in May. That's what it was, Straw Hat Day.
It was felt hat, right?
Right, Felt Hat Day was the one in September. And you weren't supposed to wear a straw hat after that. And kids felt at license to run around knocking hats off people's heads, and then got into more mischief And many of them were brought to into the courthouse somewhere around here. I don't remember which one. And their cases were overseen by a judge, and that judge's name was Judge Hatter. And that was the same judge who made the city pay Solomon Riley. I mean, it was just so much fun, like in the archives, being like, wait a second, I know this name. And then go, cross-referencing and finding where I'd found this person before.
I like that you mentioned that Riley seemed almost erased, because I heard about this place and I wanted to do a story about it on Ephemeral New York. I could not find a single photo. Without photos, I just thought, I can't even tell this story properly. But did you find any photos? Nothing, right?
Any photos of him? I mean, they're you can find stuff about Hart Island.
But the amusement park.
No, there's nothing.
Yeah, there's
of
nothing.
of what he does.
Nothing.
at all.
Right?
Yeah.
So we've gotten the signal to kind of wrap up the question. So I want to leave with one question. How do you think the 1920s compares to the 2020s? It's got a nice 100-year arc here.
I mean, the part of the impulse about writing this book was talking about things that we think of as new, and finding the ways that history dealt with them in the past. And so the major impulse along those lines was the immigration backlash. So that's really the mirroring of the 1920s and the 2020s that I started writing this book 10 years ago. It wasn't the 2020s yet, but there's always, obviously, this country's always had a backlash, an immigration backlash, and it waxes and wanes as far as how public it gets and how much public rhetoric it accrues. But that was a major reason that I want to compare these two periods. So just a quick summary. Immigration was increased in the U.S. a lot over the end of the 19th and then the first decades of the 20th century. And for various reasons, including political fears of subversives and socialism, there was a real clampdown starting there was a clampdown that manifested itself in immigration bills limiting immigration from some countries, not others, in 1921 and 1924. And there were a lot of connections to these bills to New York City in a lot of various ways. The culture of New York City was contributing to the anti-immigration sentiment in the country at the time, including a very sharp rise in KKK activity, or the beginning of KKK activity within the city itself, which is another story that we as New Yorkers do not like to tell each other, right? We like to pretend that we have always lived in this place is always, it is this enlightened history. We don't like to talk about how in the 1920s, New York was a Jim Crow city, how in the 1920s there was all this anti-immigration backlash. At the same time, there were forces trying to make the world of the city welcome for immigrants. I mean, it was not just immigration backlash. So that's a major point of comparison, I think.
Okay, so we can end it there and take any audience questions. At the top.
Is there one particular anecdote or factoid that just lives in your head that continues to surprise you from your research?
Well, the Solomon Riley one is a really good example of that, and I got obsessive about that one, and so I visited Hart Island. Have you tried this yet?
I actually have a boat trip planned later this month.
Yeah, so you can go visit Hart Island if you sign up for a Parks Department. You didn't used to be able to. It's not connected by bridge. There are no. Yeah.
Yeah, you can sign up through the Parks Department. They have special trips. You have to get a ferry at some weird place, though. Right?
Yeah, and you have to win the lottery to do it, because I mean, I tried for months.
It's like touring the City Hall train station. You used to be able to do that too. You're really lucky.
So the Hart Island one is one that, yeah, pretty much lives in my head. I mean, I just um, published an article in the Independent this week about the KKK burning a cross on the Columbia lawn. So that's a harrowing one because there was a black student living in one of the dorms. Um, so that's another. I mean, I don't know, like Dorothy Parker standing up after, and ordering after ordering the most expensive dessert, to go more lighthearted. I mean, I write about an attempted lynching in Hell's Kitchen of a young black man who was accused of sexually assaulting, depending on the newspaper report, one or two white women. For one white woman and one white girl. I mean, who knows the truth of what happens? But one of the remarkable things about that story is the way the NYPD actually played the good cops literally, and saved this 18-year-old, this homeless 18-year-old from getting lynched by a white mob. So yeah, I kind of don't know where to start and where to end answering these questions. I hope that gives you an idea. They're all living in my head now,
Oh, right in the.
I'm a little bit focused on the word hidden as what I sort of want to know about your thinking in terms of how you came to this idea about hidden histories after there's thousands of books about New York in the 20s and how this sort of came up, how you even knew these things were hidden, or, there was something about the mystery of that kind of thinking.
Well, it's partly how hard I had to work to find some of them, or how deep into the archives I was when I found things, things that I think are of such obvious interest to us today and have such cultural purchase today. So I like earlier when I was talking about things I found in the archive that I couldn't believe had not been digitized and were not online. One example is the catalogs of the exhibits of black arts at the 135th Street Library, which started in 1921. There was one in 1921, 1922. Then they took a break for a while. Then there were more later in the 20s. These were exhibits of both local and internationally known black visual artists. The catalogs are incredible, and why they're not in a book somewhere that you could take off this shelf and just flip through and see them, why they're not published themselves is sort of amazing to me. But I finally, I'm pretty sure that was on microfilm. I think I looked at them on microfilm, and then I went to the Schomburg Center because I just had to touch one of them in person. And this is what I mean. Like this is we have the history of the Harlem Renaissance. We have many books about it, but there's this sort of cultural assumption that we know all about that now, and we don't need to know more. Same thing with sites of black baseball that I talk about. So there were dozens of in the Northeast. There were dozens of black baseball teams. Major League Baseball being segregated, and some really major, no pun intended, really important ones in the New York City area. And the sites where they played were mostly not preserved. They were. I like to say that New York has a tendency to pave over itself, and you can really see that with the fact that there are these historic places of black culture that don't exist anymore. So this is what I mean by hidden, things that are not part of our popular cultural memory, even to those of us, even to the many people who have spent a lot of time thinking about, reading about, watching shows set in the 1920s or New York during the early 20th century. There's still so much there that has not been uncovered, has not been brought into public consciousness.
So I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, I just got your book, so obviously didn't have time to read it. But I was wondering if you explored some of the immigrant communities in New York at the time, and in that time, there were well over a dozen daily newspapers in New York City, and most of them were foreign, written in a foreign language, either Yiddish or German or Russian. I don't know about the 1920s, but in the late teens, the Jewish Daily Forward, which was a Yiddish newspaper, had a circulation approximately the same as the New York Times.
The answer is yes. I have a lot about the immigrant communities, and there were also newspapers in Armenian and Japanese and Ladino, and Greek and Polish, one way I go about talking about, as sort of a rhetorical device, one way I go about talking about immigrant communities in New York City at the time is I take these Lusk maps, which were, these essentially political surveillance maps that were created in 1919, and then they were popular enough to have popular versions sold. Like you could buy one. I don't know where. I tried to figure out where you could buy one. But these were maps that showed, something that we might all be interested in today, like what are the ethnic neighborhoods of New York? And we would do it because we'd want to know where to eat. And but we'd be interested in that for all kinds of reasons. These maps were made to surveil these communities. So I use those maps as a starting point for talking about immigrant communities. And one of the things I talk about is how as soon as the ink was dry, they were already outdated. And there were already new communities popping up, and communities that were thriving by the end of the 20s that were not on these maps. So I talk about some of those examples. Little Japan in Inwood, which did not make the maps. The Little Armenia, what was called at the time the Syrian colony of Lower Manhattan is on the maps, but the downtown ferry Arabic-speaking community, Sahadis, right? That was not on the maps. So I used those maps, but I tried to go in between them. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that Arabic-speaking community in downtown Manhattan. And this is something I didn't get into the book, but I still think about. So this is something that lives in my head. I write a bunch about that community, and that community had 2 record labels for Arabic heritage music across the street from one another.
Do you know about the Native American community in downtown
Well, wait,
Brooklyn?
hold on. Let me finish this. So this Arabic-speaking community had 2 records. That's how much commercial clout they had. They could support 2 record labels. And this was where the World Trade Center is now. And so, that neighborhood faded in the 30s and 40s, and then it was in the 60s that it became the World Trade Center site. But I think about how many people are visiting that area these days and have, not everyone obviously, but a lot of people have, let's say, Islamophobic inclinations and thoughts as they go and visit the 9/11 memorial. And I think about how that was once a thriving Arabic-speaking site with a strong Islamic equivalent there. And yes, I talk a little about the Gowanus neighborhood, where the Kawanake ironworkers clustered, just a little. So I got that in there too.
I guess one more question. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther.
Special thanks once again to Jonathan and Esther.
Love what you heard? Come visit us at one of our live events. You can find our upcoming events calendar on our website, ptknitwear.com, or on our Instagram at ptknitwear. Weekday Night Live's logo was illustrated by Sarah Joseph, with audio production from Sam Small. See you next time on Weekday Night Live.